All right, so I think we'll get started here. Welcome, everyone. I'm so pleased that everyone could join us today. My name is Teresa Gerbig. I'm a pharmacist and the Pharmacy Network Manager for RxE2, and I'm going to give the floor here to our CEO, Gerald Finken. Gerald.
Great. Teresa, thank you very much. I want to welcome all those who are attending today. This is our first unconference, and we have to start somewhere, and today's it. The goal of these conferences, um, I think is necessary as we move forward, is really to create value. And I'm hoping that those who are in attendance find this of value and that it just grows from here and the information that we can provide. I want to say to Teresa, a big thank you for putting this together, that we can share in this opportunity. And I want to thank our two guest speakers, Dr. Don Miller from NDSU and Mark Ost from Eric's Pharmacy, who we're going to learn quite a bit from today. So again, thanks to everybody for joining. And Teresa, thanks for making this happen.
Yeah. Thanks, Gerald. Thanks. All right. So I would first like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Donald Miller. Dr. Miller is a professor emeritus in the School of Pharmacy at NDSU. During his career, he taught courses on drug literature evaluation, rheumatologic pharmacotherapy, complementary and alternative medicine, and public health. He was chair of the pharmacy practice department from 1998 to 2015. He has published more than 80 journal articles and book chapters. During his career, he helped organize clinical trials in rheumatology and was a member of the FDA Arthritis Advisory Committee for evaluating new drug applications. Please welcome one of my favorite professors, Dr. Donald Miller.
Thank you, Teresa. I noticed there's a new version of Zoom on my computer, and I'm not seeing how to share. Would that be under More?
On mine, it's on the bottom of the screen. Eleanor, can you help me with that?
Yeah, it might be under more unless you see a very bright green button with an
Oh,
arrow.
there it is. Yep, I
Yep,
see
you
it now.
got it. Okay, good.
Okay, so that should work. There we go. All right, so thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this. I'm sure you've all had some training on the area of ethics in clinical trials before, but it's always good to review that. So I want to start with some questions for you. Is it ethical to experiment on humans in the pharmacy? Always, sometimes, or never? Anyone give an answer and tell me why you said that?
I'll answer sometimes.
Yeah, I would
Okay.
say sometimes too, but I'm not a pharmacist, so I don't know.
And the reason why I say that is because all clinical trials are different. You know, you can go to the rare and orphan diseases and start do CAR T therapy, and
Yeah.
pharmacies aren't equipped to handle that type of medication.
Okay, good. And another little trick here is, I guess we're in our minds assuming that experiment means clinical trial, but experiments are not always clinical trials either. So in 2020, I'm sure you all remember those days in the early stages of COVID. Hydroxychloroquine was suggested as a viable treatment. And at that time, there was a lot of news coverage, and there was an infectious disease physician at Sanford Hospital in Fargo who was very often interviewed on WDAY for infectious disease things. And so they asked him about doing, are we going to use hydroxychloroquine, or do you want to do clinical trials? Or do you want to wait for clinical trials? And he said, we have to use this medication now. We don't have time to do clinical trials. Would you agree with this statement? Especially in retrospect, that when you have an emergency like COVID-19 and a lack of proven treatments, should you just use anything that looks promising, or should you do clinical trials first? And again, it's kind of a tricky question, not
Yeah. I
right or
like it.
wrong answer necessarily.
Yeah. So again, I don't mind responding and saying, um, being what I know, it's like to me, it's always clinical trials first. And I want to say
Yes.
the only times that medications that I've known have gone to different indications is kind of like the side effects of medications after drugs are already approved or in the process, kind of like the well what we're doing right now with the diabetes medications.
Mhm.
It was a side effect.
Yeah. So um, what the physician was missing, I think, is that when he was using hydroxychloroquine routinely on his patients, he was experimenting. He said, we don't have time for clinical trials. Well, yes, those would take some time. But when you are using a drug in a new way, you are in fact doing an experiment on each and every patient. If you think about it, hydroxychloroquine got its publicity because of a very small study. There was something like 16 patients in the study, wasn't randomized. The endpoints were very fuzzy. There were a million problems with the study, but that led people to use hydroxychloroquine. And we know hydroxychloroquine is safe in use for rheumatoid arthritis and for lupus. So, why not try it? Problem is, this is a new indication, and hydroxychloroquine is normally used in 200 to 400 milligrams a day in rheumatology. But for COVID, hydroxychloroquine has a very long half-life. So for COVID, we need an acute effect. And so physicians were using higher doses, like 800 milligrams a day or more. And it turned out that in high doses like this, it actually caused a fairly good risk of cardiac arrhythmia. So you were doing an experiment on patients and having problems. In fact, this risk of arrhythmia got pretty widely circulated. And then patients who had rheumatic diseases got afraid to use it, that understanding that the doses were much higher in COVID than it is for rheumatology. So this one bad experiment, there were actually probably 2 or 3 early studies that were misleading, really led to a lot of problems down the line. And so ethically, that original study of hydroxychloroquine was unethical, both in the way it was conducted and in its publication. I mean, it was just inappropriate to publish something so misleading. So experiments. An experiment is any time you try something different. And obviously, if a person came up to you and said, hey, can I experiment on you? You'd go, what? I don't want to be a guinea pig. But that's what a clinical trial is. It's a form of experiment, but it's the most ethical form of experiment. You could just give new drugs to people willy-nilly and experiment that way, but you wouldn't collect data in a very organized way. So a clinical trial is the most ethical way of finding out the benefits and risks of any intervention, not just drugs. So all experiments, all clinical trials potentially provide benefits. We're always hoping this new product is going to be the big treatment for a disease. But we also know that all experiments involve risks, especially for drugs. There's always some kind of side effect. So the ethics of trials largely, not solely, but largely involve the need to minimize risk and to distribute it fairly among persons who might be considered for the trial. So if you've ever studied anything about ethics, you know that there are 3 key aspects in any aspect of ethics. So there's autonomy, beneficence, and justice or equity. So autonomy is the freedom of a patient to make decisions without coercion. It's certainly fine to invite people to participate in the clinical trial, but they need to know everything about the trial. They need to know all the known benefits of the medication or intervention, and they need to know the possible side effects, even rare ones. And so that's a little bit difficult in recruiting patients because you have to reveal to them potential side effects that may sound pretty scary. Of course, you can say it's very, very rare, but that will always turn off some patients toward the trial. But still, they need to have all the information. And so, therefore, we use informed consent. Just talking to your patient initially is a form of informing them what's going on. But then we generally want documentation of informed consent. So traditionally, they would read a piece of paper and they would sign it. Today, probably using tablets and electronic devices for them to review documents and to e-sign. But nonetheless, we need to make sure the patients are informed, give consent freely, and that is documented. Another aspect of avoiding coercion is compensation to the patients must be fair and reasonable. It's entirely appropriate to compensate patients for their time and things like that, but it can't be so much that they would participate just for the money. It's also, autonomy is also a reason why it's unethical to experiment on children or say on prisoners. A prisoner is not in a situation where he can really freely give consent. If you're promising them time off for participating in a study, that's a little bit coercive. So a lot of the rules around ethics revolve around autonomy of a patient. And it's also important as we recruit patients for a study. Beneficence means that the research must result in a net benefit to society, but not necessarily individual patients. In an experiment, some patients are going to have side effects. Some patients will not get any benefit. But a clinical trial is not the same as clinical practice. In clinical practice, as a physician or a pharmacist, you must do what you think is best for the patient. In the clinical trial, the issue is we do not know what is best for the patient. We may have a very strong hunch, but we do not know. And therefore, we do the study to provide a future benefit for patients by clearly revealing the risk to benefit ratio. So we can do experiments on even dangerous treatments if the results would result in some net benefit to society. But of course, we still want to do the experiment in the most ethical way. And that generally includes blinding if there's more than one group, control group, appropriate outcome measures, random assignment, and reasonable statistical power. So the study has to be large enough. If you go back again and look at that hydroxychloroquine study, which really used none of these. And so you could say the experiment itself was unethical and publishing it was unethical. So I know Jerry, and I know he's only doing good studies with a good study design. And so I think you're pretty comfortable with that. But we still, and of course, blinding and control groups aren't always appropriate or necessary. But in general, that's the gold standard that we aim for. And then beneficence, how do we know that there's really beneficence? We as investigators, of course, are always anxious to do a study, but we have institutional review boards that look at that to verify. So we need an independent group of people who can say, yes, this study does have greater potential benefits than risks. And sometimes we have to argue with the IRB a little bit if they don't like our study. But that is there to protect the public and be ethical. And results of good studies actually should be shared through publication and presentation. It's surprising how many studies done by drug companies never get published. These are studies that are negative and don't show any benefit for the drug. Obviously, a company doesn't really want to disseminate that very much, so they'll either choose not to publish it or publish it in a very obscure journal. But ethically, if we've exposed patients to all the risks of a clinical trial, it's essential that the results be shared as well. And then the third aspect of ethics is justice and equity. That means the risks and benefits of research must be distributed equally and fairly to all potential subjects. Again, that means we don't study prisoners or vulnerable populations of any kind. And at the same time, we must have a more representative population. So this is relevant to recruiting for trials. You may, if you're involved in recruiting, it's easy to say, oh, I like Mrs. So-and-so. She'd be great in the study because she's so easy to get along with. I don't want to invite Mr. Jones because he's so crabby all the time. I don't want him in my study. But we really want to get a more representative sample. So anyone who actually meets the criteria for a study should be invited to participate. And again, we just avoid targeting vulnerable persons of any kind. So you might think, well, so-and-so is going to be very easy to talk into doing the study. Well, if it's that easy, well, maybe he'd be considered a vulnerable person, and you should be very careful about inviting that person into the study. And then there were some other ethical issues too. Research must address an appropriate question. So studies that are repetitive are not appropriate. If you already know a certain drug works and we know its risk-benefit ratio, why do another study? Or simply exposing some patients to potential risk. Any potential risk to the patient must be minimized. And using placebo, that's often an issue too. Is that ethical to use? Because placebo is assumed to be the inferior treatment. But we can use a placebo where there is something called equipoise, meaning we really don't know if the placebo is less effective or less dangerous than the drug. Lots of new drugs in clinical trials, phase 2 and 3 studies, turn out not to be effective, in which case the person on a placebo is not missing anything at all. And new drugs certainly can have unexpected and serious side effects. In that case, the person getting the placebo may actually be getting the better treatment because they're not being exposed to the side effects. So if there is true doubt about safety and efficacy of the drug, I think a placebo as a control group is entirely ethical. But again, if we know, or we think we know at least, that a drug is superior to placebo, then including a placebo in future trials becomes unethical. And another important thing is that integrity of data must be maintained. You collect a lot of data typically during clinical trials. You can make mistakes. It's easy enough to do that, although more and more things, again, are done automatically nowadays. But you have to preserve that data, never tamper with it. Sometimes you might be tempted to say, well, I'm missing some data, I'll just make something up. I mean, you should never do anything like that. Your data is everything, and you need to maintain that integrity. And as you manipulate it, that should all be done in a way that anyone can duplicate. And so that was all I had for slides. I think that's about my 15 minutes. And I'd be glad to talk about anything related to clinical trials if we have time.
Okay. Thanks so much, Dr. Miller. I really appreciate you agreeing to share all your knowledge on clinical research and trials with us. What we're going to do is we're going to switch to our second speaker, and then we'll do questions for both of you after that, okay?
Okay.
All right. So then, Dr. Miller, don't forget to stop sharing your screen.
Yes.
All right. So while you do that, I'm going to introduce our second speaker, Mark Ost. Mark is co-owner and CEO of Eric's Pharmacy Shop and Community Pharmacy Services. Mark graduated from the University of Colorado with a business administration degree and worked in the sports industry. Let's see, Mark graduated from the University of Colorado with a business administration degree and worked in the sports industry for 7+ years after college. In 2012, Mark joined his father at Philadelphia's pharmacy and in 2019 took over as a co-owner of Eric's Pharmacy Shop. In 2023, Mark founded Community Pharmacy Services, a closed-door LTC pharmacy with 4 other business partners. When not working at the pharmacies, Mark spends much of his time consulting on pharmacy-related issues with government agencies and other community pharmacy owners. Mark lives in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, and has 2 amazing children, Elena and Stanley. And I had the privilege of meeting Mark at NCPA earlier this week. So please welcome Mark Ost.
Thanks, Teresa. Thanks for that introduction. So I kind of just wanted to make this a little bit more informal, talk about what we do and our experiences, and happy to answer any questions. I actually think it was very interesting to hear Dr. Miller's presentation and also meet with you, Teresa, and Gerald in New Orleans at NCPA, because I think one of the things that makes these clinical trials very interesting is that there's certain silos, and kind of our silo is knowing the patients. We don't know too much about the study other than what's being offered. So a lot of times when patients have questions, it's directed to some of the study group, and I think that works really well because it's especially for us, the data that we're sending you is de-identified. So you don't know which patients selected other than based off of certain factors, what medications are on, or anything in that sense. And then from our standpoint, we're calling the patients and letting them know about this opportunity without any bias, I would say, and just presenting them the facts and letting them make the decisions. One of the things that I wanted to speak about is kind of our process. And I think the value that we bring, and then community pharmacies in general, is we have that direct relationship with our patients. So when we're talking about a clinical trial, I guess there's a lot of unknown, is probably the best way to say it. And when a familiar voice or pharmacy is calling, there's credibility that we're bringing to that patient. And that credibility is allowing us to have that conversation with the patient of, again, presenting them the option of here's a partner program that we're working with, and there's this opportunity, and explaining that opportunity to them. One of the other things that we try and do is, while we are a pharmacy, and Eric, my business partner, and other pharmacists are very involved in everything, a lot of this is using non-pharmacist staff. So we have a lot of our technicians and other staff are the ones that are making that initial outreach through the supervision of a pharmacist, and our pharmacist is always doing the trainings and overseeing the program. But a lot of, again, what our process is making that patient comfortable. And it could be for a clinical trial, it could be, we do a lot of vaccines. So again, that's a controversial topic that there's a trust factor built in with that, community pharmacy and our pharmacy staff. But I think having our techs doing the bulk of the initial calls and not answering questions. I mean, one of the things that we do is our tech is the one that's usually reaching out and making that initial introduction. But if the patient has additional questions about why they qualified or what medications are on, would make us reach out to them. We've had a few patients actually raise concerns of why are we sending their information to a company, and we've explained that we're not selling the information, that we're selling de-identified data, and they were randomly selected for us to reach out to. So the company only knows you as a as a number. They don't know what your name is, where you live, other than the very general aspects. And there's been a few issues that's arisen from that. But I think, again, having that relationship with our patients, we're able to explain that to them and provide comfort in the sense that we're not just selling our data as a list to a clinical trial and asking them to enroll. The other piece is more, I think one of the most important is just that comfortability aspect of the patient. I think one of the things that we've expressed to RxE2, and they've been very supportive and listened, is patients all sometimes just don't want to travel to a different place. If they want to be able to go to their pharmacy, or they want to be able to go to their provider, whether it's to to participate in this trial or to do any other type of services. So hopefully that opportunity will present itself in the next few months, and that we can continue to reach out to these patients and provide. I mean, I view this as an opportunity. It's an opportunity for the pharmacy, but more importantly, it's an opportunity for the patients, because the other thing that we've seen from this, a lot of the patients that are agreeing to enroll in the trial are usually patients that kind of are in the sense of maybe the treatment's working, maybe it's not working as well as they would want to. So they're the ones that are really kind of excited about it and willing to look into these different features and different options. And and the hope for them is that they participate in this clinical trial, and they're obviously providing information, feedback to to RxE2 and to the manufacturers for them to do it, but something that possibly can help themselves as well. So I think that's kind of our target group of population that we've seen that is enrolled. And, I would tell you that our numbers probably speak for itself in the percentage of patients that are converted, meaning that, initial outreach call, and then at least getting them interested in enrolling in the trial. And, that's a testament to our staff that's really, doing the work and reaching out to patients and doing the trainings and providing them as much information as they want, or that we can give them, and making them comfortable. And, again, not to harp on vaccines, but, we have the same approach with vaccine. It's an individual decision that the patient has to make. We're not forcing anybody to do a clinical trial. We're not forcing anybody to get a vaccine, but we'll certainly present all the information, in a clear and concise way, and things that are scientifically backed, and let them make that educated decision. So I can pause there. And if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer it, or I'm happy to continue talking.
Yeah, please jump in if you just want to start speaking, or you can send your question through the chat for either Mark or Dr. Miller. So we'd like to use this time now to answer any questions that you might have about ethics of clinical trials or anything that Mark said as well. Anybody have questions? I'll open the floor to anybody who has any questions.
And I'll add one more thing, Teresa, too. Lisa
Oh,
Coulter, who's on the Zoom as well, is one of our technicians, and she's done a lot of our calls working with Michelle to do this. So she could probably come off mute and answer some questions too.
I guess Mark said an interesting thing about a lot of his patients with neuropathy or pain will quite readily agree to be in a study. I found that too. Rheumatology, anyone who has chronic pain, we all know you never take the pain away completely. And so those patients are usually quite interested in being in a study. They're almost a vulnerable population. I mean, you could talk them into doing almost anything. So in that case, rather than trying to persuade them, you almost have to be very careful to say, well, this is an experiment. It could have side effects.
yeah, good point, Dr. Miller.
And I think that's important too, exactly what you said. We're not over promising, under delivering. It's something that the patient should know all the facts going into, and obviously has to agree to it. But I don't want to say it's not initial phone call we're reaching and telling them about this great opportunity that's going to save their life. It's something that it's presenting an opportunity for them to look into and provide. And we can certainly provide feedback when requested, but we'll present the information and let them make that decision.
So Mark, I have a question maybe for Lisa if she's doing the calls to respond. And it had to actually do with something that Dr. Miller mentioned that was actually I learned something, and that is do patient ask will it be on a placebo? Have they asked that?
Lisa's here.
Yeah, we do ask that often.
So yes, they have asked that often.
And what's your response?
How do you respond?
I just respond with, yeah, it could be an option that you can get the placebo. Is possible, that you can, just won't know until the end. So, I let them know all the facts that, you can, so they can make that decision for themselves.
And a lot of times it's just kind of, we have that first level call. This also might be a situation where Lisa or Michelle, whoever says, we're going to schedule another call with the pharmacist or someone from there where they can talk more in depth about that trial or that drug or, whatever it is, so that, again, we're just providing whatever information we have, which I think is a good thing, is that we don't have all the information, which in my opinion, bodes well to making this work.
So out of all my years working in clinical trials, Dr. Miller explained something. It's like I'm forgetting. God, I'm so optimistic about the trials, because of where we are, especially in today with today's technology, to be thinking that the drug may only be as good as a placebo. The placebo might be better, and or again the side effects. So the idea is like I always think like placebo, oh yeah, it's like you're not going to get the treatment. Well, sometimes that's the whole purpose. Anyhow, so Dr. Miller, I learned something from you when you mentioned that
Well,
that
thanks. Yeah, so I know usually they'll just say on the form, because that form 50-50 chance or whatever the actual chance is people understand 50-50. But then, of course, sometimes in studies, patients who are on the placebo have a chance to get the active drug after the study is over, and that's another incentive for them if that's applicable.
I guess question, go kind of re-asking your question, Gerald. How would RxE2 like us to respond to that question? With Teresa or Siobhan?
well, I think just as you did, and some of this is like what I just learned from Dr. Miller. It's like to remind people, what this is. Um, Again, the more information of just saying again, like the coercion, like, oh no, the drug's going to be better. Not always. So that's kind of was I just found very insightful. Um, and in most cases, I can talk to any patient, just as Lisa just said, like, yes, there's a chance you're going to be on the placebo and we'll find out. But also then the protocol, like what Dr. Miller said, most of the time, of course, there's standard of care that you're going to be receiving and or that you move on. If in a certain period of time you don't see efficacy or changes, that more and more protocols are doing standard of care. And with the ability to be on drug at a later time. But that's knowing each protocol where they are.
Yeah, I think you're answering the question very accurately. I mean, we want to state the facts. The facts are you could be assigned to a placebo branch versus the investigational product. And I think just being honest with them, I think sometimes patients don't know a lot about clinical trials, so they may just be asking questions that might not deter their interest necessarily, but being, I think, factual with them because we don't want to coerce them into participating or just letting them know that at the next steps of the process, they will reach the recruitment team if they're eligible and can ask lots of questions about how the process works and how they'll be assigned and all of that. So sometimes it's just the just feeling more assured that you have the information you have, like you said, to make the decisions you need to make. But I think you're answering the questions very, very well.
Yep, it's all about transparency, and they trust you. And as long as you're transparent and explain everything to them, you can't go wrong.
And as Gerald mentioned too, the
Mhm.
standard of care, patients, sometimes it's good to let them know that they'll receive some of the best health care when they're in a clinical trial. They will be observed and things will be looked into further and more detailed than on a traditional basis. So at any point in time, they have concerns about the trial. There's no contracts to a clinical trial. So if they ever had concerns or anything along the way, they have options to leave that clinical trial. Of course, we want them to get to the end because that's where we get the most defined information, but just letting them know those upfront factual pieces of information. They're going to get great medical care while they're in the trial. It's at no cost to them. There are things that are out of their control, whether they get the treatment branch or the placebo. But again, just the transparency I think is really important. That's why I think it helps that it's someone they trust and that they know as a pharmacist speaking out to them versus a cold call from a stranger that they don't know.
All right, great discussion, everybody. We're going to move on to our third and final speaker. Our last speaker is Gerald Finken. Gerald is a licensed pharmacist with over 40 years of experience in the biotechnology and pharmaceutical industries. In 1997, he founded CSM, a clinical supplies packaging and labeling company where he invented on-demand packaging and labeling, clinical trials research pharmacist, CTRP services, and pioneered direct-to-patient services. In 2013, he founded CenterPoint Clinical Services and subsequently created the innovative siteless CRO model. In 2020, Gerald launched RxE2, where he now serves as CEO and is bringing the practice of pharmacy to clinical trials. Please welcome the visionary of RxE2, Gerald Finken.
Thanks. I forgot who's the speaker. But all this is near and dear, and it's interesting. As we were just talking, pharmacists are talking, right? Pharmacy technicians, staff, et cetera. And as we respond to patients and everybody, all we have to be is ourselves. And when I think about, like, as you read my bio, if even though I was in the industry and stuff, I'm a pharmacist wannabe throughout because everything I did was trying to bring the practice of pharmacy in a very regimented, strict, doesn't change world of clinical research. And and I want to say I brought the skills, like I'd worked in the industry my whole career, and I focused on clinical supplies, and we're better than a pharmacist to work in drug supplies, right, in supply chain logistics. But the whole time, when I think about, focusing on that is I did work at the VA for a time. I did dispense in a community pharmacy. I got my training at a chain pharmacy when I was an undergraduate. And so I've had, dispensing as part of my career until the last few years, of course, in having my own business, and I think Mark, you'd understand that too. Like you focus on, and Justin, I don't know how much I see you're on how much like you are dispensing these days, um, but in any case, the whole purpose of everything we're doing today and kicking off this meeting is to get pharmacists involved in clinical trials. And I've done this in a couple different ways. And I won't go into the on-demand and stuff because that's all about trying to get the pharmacy dispensing into the clinical research realm. So I do want to talk about the clinical trials research pharmacist. And that is something that Dr. Tina Schleck, she's our chief pharmacy officer at RxE2, she really came up with that. And what we found is that in the clinical supplies process, we're shipping medication to the sites. We're hearing the clinical research associates who go to those sites talk how great this drug is. Again, it's like Dr. Rifke said, like there's this hunch. We're hearing all this great feedback, but they could be on placebo. You don't know. And anyhow, so they went to the FDA to get approved, and it failed, right? And they were concerned about the side effects because it was pramlintide. It's public information, so it's pramlintide, and for diabetes, and it's an exenatide, which we all know the GLP-1s. You get 2 weeks of nauseousness, and so in any case, we looked at that and something was wrong, something was off. And Dr. Schleck and I both knew, based on what we were seeing in the drug returns, et cetera, that we felt it was just a matter of patients not following, being compliant with the medication. And so we went to then Dr. Orville Coulterman, who was the chief medical officer at Amlin, and said, listen, we have this very unique concept called counseling that when a patient gets their medication, let us talk to the patient as pharmacists and hear what they have to say. And so we had open-ended questions, et cetera. And based upon that, when they went to the FDA the third time to get approval, it got approved. And that's because as the pharmacists were talking to patients, we found out what was really going on in the trial. So of course, with that success, we then went on to exenatide, and that drug, again, 2 weeks of extreme nauseousness before you start seeing efficacy, et cetera, that got approved first time. And so that inspired me to say, like, we need pharmacy, practice of pharmacy, pharmacists, technicians, and everything we do in clinical research. And such, we then coined the term a clinical trials research pharmacist. And the idea there is that we're pharmacists, but maybe some special training in clinical research. And most importantly, now what we're saying is to look at this, like one day, maybe there'll be a certification, we'll look at that. But the idea is to know that if you're a clinical research pharmacist, you have your expertise in the clinic, in the community, but you also know the nuances of clinical trials because there are nuances like documentation and training and GCP, GMP, and things, those types of terminology. So based upon what we've done and the success we had, we see the clinical trials research pharmacist, which to me, this is like a kickoff meeting for that. Pharmacists talking to other pharmacists, technicians talking to pharmacists, community care workers talking in the pharmacy, in the community pharmacy setting to talk about clinical trials. What's working, what's not working. So I want to say, Lisa and Mark, this is the first time like ever, right, that pharmacists are talking to like industry, and kicking this off because we will have pharmacists from the industry in these conferences as well as we continue on. So that was the concept of the CTRP and where we're going to go with the concept. And I just know it's going to have a big impact on clinical trials. And most importantly, there's three things that the industry's been faced with for 40 years. The recruitment of patients into clinical trials that we've talked about, the compliance of the medication, and the retention. And all I can say, Mark, is when I think about every grant program you're on, what are the three things you have to do? You have to get patients into it. You have to keep them on the medication, right? And they're compliant with it. And then they're showing results, which is why now payers are coming to pharmacies to do clinical services. And so I look at this like the community pharmacist has this solved already. And yet the industry is 40 years out from trying to get this done. So anyhow, that's the purpose of like the CTRP is how do we take the successes in the community pharmacy and bring it into clinical research? So with that, I'll go kind of to the second topic, which I find very interesting, and I'm going to challenge everybody on the call. I would just attended various conferences for both in the like NASP and NCPA, and I attended Society for Clinical Research Sites on the industry side, and I attended Innovation Network Gathering, again, like 300 small think tank group on innovation. And on the pharmaceutical side, all they kept talking about was trust. We have to build trust. We know pharma industry, the patients don't trust us. We've got to get the community awareness. We want to hear what the patients have to say. And then when I go over to the NCPA and the NASP, it's like it's like everything that's we already have the trust. We know that. Here we are, we're delivering. It's like now how do we take that further to the payer? And of course, you are delivering that in the clinical services. So when I think about pharma and I think about having the pharmaceutical industry embrace the community pharmacists, I think about one thing, and that's this trust. And so I want to challenge us to come up with a trust index. What are the units of trust? Kind of like what is the units of love, right? Trying to define it. But I'm telling you, pharma, that's all they care about. Like for us, everything we can do with referrals and community outreach there, they care about randomized patients. They care about what is the cost per patient, what is the cost per visit, it's dollars, dollars, dollars in data. And so I want to create this idea of a unit of trust, right? Trust units. And I'll take it this way. I've always kind of been a little upset that like pharmacists are like number 3 or 4 in the most trusted professionals, nurses came in were number 1, doctors, we're always top 2, 3, 4, 5. And then what I started thinking about is how do you build trust? Do you trust somebody after 1 time meeting a person? After 2 times? 3? Right. And so I think about like who I trust. And sometimes you get a gut feeling like, oh, I think I could trust that person. But after 1 visit, how about if you see them like once a year for the last 5 years? And so what I want to say is you see your primary care doctor. I mean, thank God for me, I don't really see a primary care doctor, but once a year, twice a year, their staff and the nurse that you see with them, unless it's like home health, twice a year. So you develop 2 trust units. How many trust units do you develop as a pharmacist? At least 12, right? They say up to 32 times a year you've seen a pharmacist. And so sometimes I want to say, like, let's talk about this whole thing of trust and let's put a unit behind it and a trust unit, a trust factor that, so to me, are we 12 times more trustworthy because we had 12 times as many times to become untrustworthy? Anyhow, so that's just I'm going to throw that out there as for us all to think about because it's something we know in the community practice that patients trust us. And why? Because we're always honest with them. Vaccines, where else can you go? I don't know of any pharmacist that I've met that doesn't give the options and the facts and what they know. And so, we develop this trust. Not to say doctors and nurses don't, but we're in the trenches seeing, every other week, every month, et cetera. So I don't have an answer for it, but I just want to put it out there. And I want to say thank you for the time. And I'll leave it at that, Teresa. Sound okay? And ask if there's any questions.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, please, any questions, whether related to Gerald's talk or the previous 2. So we'd love to hear your thoughts or anything like that. So please ask away. Everybody's so quiet. No questions?
Actually, I had a question for Mark and Lisa, but first, Dr. Miller, Mark, everybody, thanks for presenting. For the patients that you work with to introduce trial opportunities to, do you ever kind of circle back or hear back from them about kind of what they experienced after talking to you and how it went, and any feedback or thoughts on that part of the journey for them?
Yeah, I can answer this and I can bring Lisa in to answer some more. I would say it's more of, it's not really something that we're reaching out to them. It's something more they're letting us know, um, after the fact. Hold on one second. Lisa, you got that?
No, I mean, I don't usually hear from them after they've gone into the process of the trial. I just kind of initiate it and ask the initial questions. I try to get as personal as I can, so to build the trust, as you had said, so that they are more, enticed to try the clinical trial. But once they start the trial, it then goes on to that company, and I don't hear from them again. Typically.
So I would just say, from my experience, most patients actually enjoy being in trials because they get lots of special attention. They see, they have a lot of visits with the doctor and the nurse. They're examined carefully. They feel like they're being treated really well. And so I would say, for the most part, you are putting people in good hands in a trial.
Yeah, great points, great points. Well, gosh, thanks so much everybody for joining us, and a big thank you to Dr. Miller, Mark, and Gerald for speaking today. We really appreciate it, and we hope to do more of these here soon. So keep an eye out for that. And I'm going to share my screen here just in case you have any questions. You can certainly reach out to me. Here is my information here. If you can see my screen, okay? With my information. Is that showing up all right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is now.
Can you see it?
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Okay,
No.
perfect. All right, just wanted to be sure. Listen to me. So that's my information. If you have any questions or concerns or have ideas for speaking, if you want to speak, we are definitely taking names and we'll reach out to you. So we'd love to hear from you. You can either reach me by phone, email, or through our website. So I will let everybody go. But thanks again, everybody. We appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.